Thanks, Carter. I want to recognize all those who have supported the lecture series this semester, including Stan Benfill, who is the director of the Kennedy Center, who's with us today. We're grateful to have his support for this series. Also, our students that have facilitated this series throughout the semester. So Abby Child, Kimball Moffett, and Mirabella Keogh. We just want to recognize you and say thank you for the effort that you've put in. Today we will hear from Brendan Murphy, who will present on organizational challenges for freedom of religion and belief NGOs. Libby Reynolds, who will present on the fall of the Berlin Wall, rise of the Firewall, and Rachel Stark, who will present a paper on Between Strategy and Suspicion, German Foreign Policy Toward Revolutionary Soviet Russia, 1914 to 1924. I will introduce each of them just a little bit in turn before their presentations, and we will begin with Brendan Murphy. Brendan is a philosophy and English double major. He's also a Scandinavian Studies minor. This summer he is going to be doing some interfaith work in the United Kingdom. He's from Springville, Utah. He likes to ski. He has a dog named Daisy. We're excited to welcome Brendan Murphy.
Alrighty, thank you for coming, everybody. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about organizational challenges and roadblocks facing freedom of religion or belief NGOs. But to start off, I will just talk a little bit about my introduction to the field. It was fall of 2023. I was an intern at Parliament, working as a liaison between parliamentarians, NGOs, and the FCDO, or the Foreign and Commonwealth Division. And while there, I was a speechwriter, a policy advisor, and I wrote a lot about freedom of religion or belief. And yeah, that's how I got into the field, and I love London. First, to start off, we want to address the question, what is FORB, freedom of religion or belief? FORB is a term that isn't commonly used in the United States. Rather, it's more commonly used in the United Kingdom. It's become common, especially over the last 20 years in the UK, while in the US, religious freedom is a much more common term. The usage of FORB has spread to countries about evenly with how religious freedom is used. Commonwealth countries are much more likely to use the term FORB, while because of the work of the international humanists. Their work has been especially important in promoting the use of the term FORB, and in the Council of Europe's Convention on Human Rights, which was adopted into UK law in the 1998 Human Rights Act, FORB is used, and similarly inclusive language, including freedom of conscience and religion. I have chosen to use the term FORB because of its inclusive nature, as well as because of its broader connotations in the advocacy space and its avoidance of populist political attachments, especially in the United States. Now, to begin the presentation, I will summarize the findings of my research on challenges facing small NGOs. And these grassroots small NGOs tend to have budgets under $5 million per year. And the reason I'm doing this is because there's been a dramatic growth in grassroots NGOs over the last 25 years, particularly since 9/11. I believe it's 95%. Yeah, 95% of NGOs being started in the last 5 to 10 years are grassroots NGOs. They operate on very small budgets, and 91% operate on budgets under $1 million per year. So really small operating budgets. NGOs working in FORB vary widely in terms of focus area, organizational size, and methods. Most academic research on FORB to this point has sought to analyze violations of FORB, so like human rights violations, and contributing cultural and legal influences, with the roles of NGOs primarily as good guy characters in broader contexts or on government policy initiatives. And so to begin, I'll start off with a legal overview. To begin, it is important to understand the legal space civil society advocates occupy in their advocacy efforts. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the touchstone document in today's corpus of international human rights law. It and the subsequent International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights make up the International Bill of Human Rights. And this functions as the guide and theoretical backing for all human rights law, which is enforceable at the International Criminal Court. While the Bill of Human Rights doesn't necessarily provide for legal mechanisms or enforcement, it provides the basis for enforceable documents, which the International Criminal Court operates based upon. Unfortunately, most human rights violations occur in total disregard of international agreements, as seen in situations all across the world right now. And this shows the need for stronger implementation strategies from the global community. The UN, national bodies, and civil society NGOs all work together to raise the standard for human rights compliance globally, so it's a really cooperative effort. Large human rights NGOs, which often work on many different aspects of human rights concerns and on a variety of different types of projects, tend to work on FORB peripherally. So they tend to address issues of freedom of religion or belief, but not directly, and sometimes they don't even address it at all. And because of that, there's been a dramatic increase in small, particularly religious NGOs. They work to protect vulnerable populations. They work in policy development and international development projects, oftentimes in coordination with governmental philanthropic actors, although, as I will argue, not enough. Now, we'll address a few challenges facing these NGOs. Although funding for FORB-focused NGOs and for adjacent human rights efforts seems to be on the rise, there remains a lack of effective organizational infrastructure, especially for small-scale NGOs with lower project volumes. And again, these are NGOs operating on really small budgets, and usually they're only employing 2 to 5 employees. Sometimes it's more, sometimes they have bigger bases. An example is like Christian Solidarity Worldwide. It's a pretty major organization in terms of policy advocacy, but they're really operating on a very small budget. Now, these services employ thousands when they get bigger, but at the beginning, they're really quite small. The shift to the grassroots NGO carries many benefits, including an increased and more specialized reach into FORB. They're working on really specific projects and human rights concerns, and there's increased involvement in the local community. But it also carries many challenges, and that's what I sought to address in my larger paper and in this project overall. In her paper on religious grassroots NGOs, Alison Schnabel sets out some of these issues. She notes, like larger aid agencies, these groups need income, public legitimacy, and local partners. But grassroots NGOs need to meet these needs without the advantages of name recognition, professional training, and staff, or connections with host country governments or United Nations agencies. In other words, grassroots NGOs just don't have the resources that large NGOs and their networks carry. They rely on relatively few employees and an immense amount of labor, which has traditionally been simplified through established philanthropic and religious networks. Labor and time are increasingly spent building smaller, more specialized networks. And while, again, this carries benefits, the costs merit consideration. Such sustained efforts among few employees make sustainable growth and longevity difficult goals for grassroots organizations to realize. In FORB advocacy and philanthropy, especially as it relates to international development, longevity and sustainability are vital, leaving grassroots organizations and FORB civil society in a really difficult position. While I have not provided recommendations for small FORB NGOs to resolve organizational challenges, I'll provide some suggestions. As we work towards a solution, there seems like there are several avenues that would allow small NGOs to become more effective, because the fact is that they're really not too effective sustainably over a period of over 5 years. Now, I suggest that the solution seems to lie in the development of small grassroots NGOs organizational networks. In essence, this would entail the development of grassroots superstructures, so multiple NGOs working together on long-term projects with dedicated streams of funding and organizational protocol. Because if you're operating on budgets under $5 million, and especially operating on budgets under $1 million, then you're going to be unable to fund large staffs. And that means that as staff turnover increases, which is super common, especially as these NGOs are started by people in local communities, then you won't be able to develop long-term projects. And so say an NGO is working in Nigeria to promote freedom of religion or belief for Christians in northern Nigeria, where they're heavily persecuted. In fact, one Christian dies every 14 minutes in northern Nigeria. And so there's a bunch of small grassroots NGOs working in northern Nigeria to protect Christians seeking to exercise their belief actively. But these have super common turnover. They're losing employees very quickly. I mean, a lot of these are run by mom and pop shops, basically. We have several of these in Utah. They're all across the world, lots in the UK. And as life gets busy, these projects end, and so they're really not too effective, unfortunately. They can make small-scale changes occasionally, but the fact is that they're really not that effective. And so by bunching NGOs, or creating these NGO superstructures across geographical boundaries, we can create more sustainable networks and streams of funding. And so as we gather funding together through these networks, we'll create staffs and organizational protocol that allow for projects to continue even as grassroots NGOs experience turnover. While this is incredibly difficult to do, it seems like there are two ways that we can adequately allow for these superstructures to develop. The first is through embedding officials in the FCDO or the State Department and in trade unions and trade structures inside and outside the government that allow for organizational protocol to develop independent of the superstructures themselves. In other words, we develop connections within government agencies and within trade unions that allow for trade unions focused on human rights. They exist, I promise. And in order to allow for people basically to develop structures of organization outside of the NGOs, basically areas of authority. And so that way, when we establish streams of funding, we allow for structures to continue and projects to continue outside of the existence of the NGOs themselves, while still maintaining the effectiveness of niche NGOs, which can really focus in on issues and areas that are really important, but don't get the attention that they deserve from large organizations like Save the Children or Christian Aid. So, in conclusion, I'd like to offer just one or two examples of my own work in FORB advocacy to show, first of all, how we have failed in helping grassroots NGOs. Christian Solidarity Worldwide is an organization that operates in Brazil, in the UK, in the United States, all across the world. I'd like to focus on their work in Pakistan. They have an incredible network of Muslims, Christians, and Sikhs working to promote harmony in war-torn and just really problematic situations, particularly seeking to protect the worship of Ahmadiyya Muslims. Now, unfortunately, we've experienced incredible turnover in Christian Solidarity Worldwide, which operates under a $5 million budget in the UK. Because it's actually under $2 million, because they only have 4 to 5 employees, even though they have a huge presence in Pakistan in the government. And so, unfortunately, we're losing our protections for Ahmadiyya Muslims. Ahmadiyya Muslim attacks have increased over the last year because, honestly, Christian Solidarity Worldwide has experienced turnover. So as we develop a network with Christian Solidarity Worldwide and other religious organizations working in Pakistan, and there are many, we will be able to develop a sustainable development project. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brendan. Appreciate that. Our next speaker will be Libby Reynolds. Libby Reynolds is from Sacramento, California. She's an international relations major. She has minors in German and civic engagement. She will spend the summer in Europe studying threats to democracy there, and will be graduating in August of this year. Libby will be focusing on the topic of Fall of the Berlin Wall, Rise of the Firewall, the rise of the AfD in Germany. Please join me in welcoming Libby Reynolds.
Hello, everybody. I am super thankful for the opportunity to be speaking to you today about a topic that in some ways is personal to me, the rise of the right in Germany. My interest in the AfD began when I was serving as a full-time missionary in Germany. During these 18 months, I lived in both the east and the west of Germany. I interacted with communities, both religious and broader. In East Germany, the religious communities that I interacted with in many ways were incredibly supportive of immigrant populations, helping provide food, resources, traveling with us, hosting English and German language cafes, but I also came to know that many of my close friends were supporters of the AfD. So when I came back to BYU after these experiences abroad, I realized that the AfD did not have positive connotations when it came to support of immigrants. I encountered a different narrative about the AfD, frequently described as radical, nationalist, and xenophobic, a characterization supported by credible evidence. Germany's Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution has classified the AfD as a suspected extremist organization due to its anti-democratic tendencies and discriminatory rhetoric. In November of 2023, AfD members attended a meeting discussing plans for the mass deportation of immigrants and non-assimilated citizens, leading to widespread protests and violence across Germany. These developments have intensified debate about the party's alignment with democratic values and the resilience of Germany's democratic institutions. Concerns about the AfD are serious and credible. But I found myself asking, were the people that I met in East Germany who were supporters of the AfD anomalies? Or was there a broader, more complicated story behind AfD support, one that was not entirely captured by headlines or party manifestos? The question drove my investigation. Oh, we'll go here and then go back. How does a party like the AfD grow so rapidly in support, especially in the East? This slide underscores what I saw on the ground. In 2013, with the founding of the AfD, there was 4.7% support. In the most recent federal election, there was 20.8% support, with the AfD being the second largest political party in Germany. What started as isolated voices of frustration quickly transformed into widespread political momentum. So here's a map of the most recent election, and you can see here the vote share by percentage. So this isn't the largest number of votes because, as we'll get to, there are actually quite a few votes in West Germany, but of the percentage of the electorate, as you can see, the highest percent vote share is in East Germany. So these maps show where seats were allocated from votes for the AfD. So Germany has a very interesting election type electoral system. They use a mixed member proportional representation system with each voter casting 2 ballots. The first vote is for a local candidate. So typically, the local candidate that wins is the one that has the largest number of support, the highest percent of support. Whoever receives the most votes wins the seat. That's the first round. That's what this is showing on the left. So every single first round vote that the AfD received came from East Germany. The second vote shows the overall proportion of seats. And they're reallocated so that proportionally it's represented. But as you can see, all the second round votes, or most of the second round votes, came from West Germany. This shows that even though the AfD doesn't have the largest proportion of votes in West Germany, there is still a very, very large voter base. This is a map of what the current Bundestag, or parliament, looks like. The thick circles are showing the first round votes from East Germany, the light circles showing the first round votes from West Germany. If you look at the blue section here, you can see that all the first round votes, as the map was showing, for the AfD came from East Germany, but that entire section, the other section of blue, for representatives in parliament, are elected from West Germany. So there's a broad support for the AfD across both East and West Germany, but there are different types of support. So moving on a little bit to average political views of the AfD. 1 indicates strong left-leaning and 7 indicates strong right-leaning. The AfD is at 5.9. They are substantially different from the rest of the political parties in Germany in terms of being incredibly strongly right-leaning. So, what is the firewall? I mentioned it at the beginning, but what does this actually mean? A key concept to understand: in German politics, the firewall refers to long-standing refusal of mainstream parties to form coalitions with the AfD, regardless of how many votes they win. This has remained in place even though the AfD is currently the second largest political party. The firewall forces traditional parties into an unusual alliance. So the current government in Germany is the CDU and the SPD. The CDU is more conservative, the SPD is more liberal. Even though it would have been easier for the CDU to form a coalition with the AfD, another right-leaning political party, they chose the political party that had the third largest number of votes and was more left-leaning, as to keep the AfD out of the ruling coalition. So there's a difference in application of the firewall between the West and the East. The West has held firm to it, but in the East, in regional governments and state governments, there are coalitions formed between the AfD and other political parties, as the AfD is the majority. So there isn't as many options to form coalitions. So who are the AfD voters? How do they differ from the average German voter? Theories point to immigration backlash, East-West identity divides, economic precarity, COVID response, and distrust in democratic institutions. But none of these alone explained why support was growing in places with less immigration, or why support was growing before the pandemic, or other factors that sort of knock down some of the validity of any of these theories individually. So some of the hypotheses, we won't get into all of them, but I was looking at the difference between East and West voters for the AfD. Does support differ between these regional areas? And what is different between AfD and non-AfD voters? So there was a survey experiment done by Dr. Professor Quinn Meekum, and Abby Child. I helped with a little bit of the translation for that was ran right before the 2025 federal election in Germany. So the findings that I'm about to present came from this survey and the results. If you'd like to see the survey, you can scan the QR code. It's also on the next slide. This is an overview of what the survey experiment was like. So first, individuals would answer if they are from an Arab country or German with no migration background. They were assigned to treatments that would either tell them that they were in the majority or the minority, matching their actual identity. Pre-treatment questions for all respondents looked at demographics, political histories, etc. And then the post-treatment questions looked at attitudes and how attitudes might shift based off of people perceiving they were in the majority or the minority. Key findings. So, demographics of the AfD. First, AfD respondents are primarily male, even though the sample size was predominantly female. And this was adjusted for weighting as well. AfD respondents are primarily from rural areas. AfD supporters are, on average, older than the average respondent. And they are more likely to be working full-time or retired, as opposed to working part-time or a student. So there are studies that say the AfD voters are more economically disadvantaged, but on the contrary, our survey indicated that AfD voters tend to be on the extremes, so lower income or higher income. There was an interaction that showed that distrust in government, as well as higher economic status, predicted AfD support. So that was something that I had not seen before. They are more likely to have received an apprenticeship education instead of university education. They are more likely to have completed education when they were younger, perhaps indicating a lower level of education. And they are more likely to be from East Germany. So, what can we see about attitudes? So, when looking at, there was a question that determined anti-immigration attitudes based off of a labor priming, so if there was fear about not having a job, or another question asked if they would eat Arabic or German food if they went to a restaurant. And this found that questions that related to labor and labor scarcity and economic conditions caused more of a difference in respondents between AfD voters and non-AfD voters, indicating that it was these economic issues that were more salient than cultural issues. support for police checks. This was the largest difference in the entire survey. With AFD supporters in the B1 treatment, the minority treatment, 93.9% of them supported police checks for migrants. That is a substantial difference from the 46.2% and the 38.7% of non-AFD supporters, indicating anti-immigration attitudes, but also fear of physical safety. Overall, the AFD had a much higher propensity to say that we should not give refugees or immigrants housing in Germany, as opposed to non-AFD voters. More exclusionary refugee policies, significantly less supportive of refugee integration, regardless of their treatment or region. So the party support was the biggest predictor, not being from the East or being in one of the treatments. This was very interesting to me, is that we had two questions, one that asked what we should do with refugees who had been in Germany for more than 2 years, and refugees who had been in Germany for less than 2 years. And there was more inclusive support for refugees who had been in Germany for less than 2 years. This was not part of the question, but my thought might be is that because a lot of the more recent immigration has been individuals from Ukraine. So perhaps that is indicating a difference in attitudes towards different types of refugees. So a surprising regional trend also found that East Germans are slightly more supportive of refugee integration, which was somewhat unexpected. And the AfD voters from East Germany are significantly less supportive of government economic intervention, which perhaps indicates distrust of institutions. Continuing on with distrust, the AfD support and being from the East both predict distrust of institutions, but AfD support more so than regional differences. So, key findings: East German AfD voters are less economically populist. They are distinct in their support for economic protectionism, cultural exclusivity, and restrictive refugee policies. There's a unique institutional pattern, and these results do support hypotheses. These are quotes from AfD supporters, just on the survey. I think it shows a wide range of reasons for voting. One that I find the most interesting is the one where it says people are coming into the country who treat women and homosexuals badly, which isn't usually a quote that you expect from a right-wing populist party. But overall, people want change. And the firewall may prevent the AfD from holding power, but it doesn't stop people from voting for them. Until the roots of that support are addressed, especially in the East, I don't believe that there will be meaningful engagement with the real political crisis. The rise of the AfD is best understood at the intersection of economics, identity, and trust, and it requires a response that meets people where they are, not just with policies, but with recognition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Libby. Our final speaker today will be Rachel Stark. Rachel is an international relations and German double major from Memphis, Tennessee. She will be interning in Berlin this summer, so you'll see a common German theme here. She's a fan of jazz music, very interesting person. Please join me in welcoming Rachel Stark.
Okay, following Libby's fantastic presentation, I'm excited to present to you my research. We're going to stay in Germany. We're just going to go back a few years to 1914, and I will tell you about German foreign policy towards revolutionary Soviet Russia. And in kind of exploring this decade from 1914 to 1924, in a broader context, I sought to explain what factors lead to the formation of foreign policy. What do people consider when they create a foreign policy towards another state? So there are two broad camps kind of in the scholarship here, and they vehemently disagree with each other. Those who espouse kind of a geopolitical theory would argue that people, when they form foreign policy, only consider material interests. These are things like territory, resources, access to economic markets, and trading. This is to increase the power that a state has relative to other states on the international system. However, opposite to that, What about people who prioritize intangible interests like ideas? So in a democratic state, this might be things like the rule of law or equal rights. And in a communist state, this might be the promotion of a world revolution. So when we form foreign policy with regard to ideology, this might suggest that we do not cooperate with people, with states of a conflicting ideology. So this would suggest that a democratic state would not cooperate with a communist state because they have inherently contradictory ideas, which might lead to some regime vulnerability, which we'll get to in just a second. But to kind of understand what this looks like in Germany, 1914 to 1924, I'm going to present to you some historical context. So 1914 to 1918, we have the First World War. Kind of near the end of that, 3 years into the First World War, we have the rise of Lenin's Communist Party, which is the Bolsheviks in Russia. And he kind of believes that in order to preserve his own revolution domestically, there must be an international revolution as well. This is kind of key to Marxist ideology. So keep in mind that he wants to export revolution, and we'll see in a second how he targets Germany specifically. Near the end of the war, just right before it, or just following it actually, the Weimar Republic forms in Germany. So this is, kind of like a new springing democratic state, but it's very, very weak. Rulers and kind of leaders in the state are in and out within oftentimes a few months, sometimes a few years. So it's very hard to keep a hold on power in the state. And kind of right at the start of this formation, we see an immediate burst of German socialist revolutionary activity. So we'll see this from 1918 to 1923. Germany held Europe's and the world's second largest socialist party at the time, obviously second only to the communists in Russia. And they immediately kind of sought to overturn the government we saw in the Weimar Republic. So there's a lot of domestic instability in November 1918, just following World War I. A year later, we see the Treaty of Versailles, which is going to significantly constrain Germany's material power, especially with regard to the international system. So Germany is forced to pay reparations to the Western states, to concede territory, and to demilitarize. This makes it really hard to hold a significant control of sovereignty, which is going to challenge its position on the international system and encourage Germany to prioritize material interests. So what does this all suggest, this kind of historical context, what does it suggest about cooperating or conflicting with Soviet Russia? To understand this, I'm going to show you some propaganda. So on the bottom left here, we're going to look first, we see Lenin, and he's saying the victory of communism is inevitable, right? He's seeking to spread this world revolution, and he's targeting Germany to do so. He's sweeping world leaders off of the globe. On the right here, we see a piece of propaganda that suggests that you should vote for the Spartacus Party, which is this radical socialist party in Germany. And we kind of immediately see with this picture how the Spartacus Party is a very big threat to the domestic regime in Germany, given that he's smashing the parliament with his communist flag. So here we might see how civil leaders in Germany are really, really concerned about the Bolshevik threat. However, so from their concern, they're going to say, don't join the Bolshevik League. The red bayonets are inherently against Europe. Spain is going to be the first victim. Bolshevism only brings destruction and death, but never peace. So, that would suggest that we do not cooperate with Soviet Russia. If Soviet Russia is actively trying to undermine the regime in power, we should not cooperate. However, consider at the same time, 1919, the Treaty of Versailles, Germany signs it and loses all of its coercive power. Soviet Russia at this time is the only other large pariah state, which means they are not incorporated with the West. They're the only other large pariah state with which Germany has an option to cooperate. If it can't militarize respecting the West Treaty of Versailles, it might try to secretly form military ties with Soviet Russia. It also might open up extra markets. So here we see that if we prioritize our material interests, we should cooperate with Soviet Russia. So prioritizing a geopolitical theory, we cooperate with Soviet Russia. But if we prioritize our ideological threat, we oppose Soviet Russia. What does this mean then? We have two conflicting ideas. How do states form foreign policy when their ideological interests inherently clash with their material interests? We want to prioritize the survival of our domestic government at home. It's very weak, it's hard to hold power, but at the same time, we want Germany to be a strong enough state to be a force and to maybe even, get back some of its power that it lost. Okay. So, the answer. Germany is going to prioritize both, but they're going to do it based on agents who hold power. So, systemic theories are really popular in international relations literature, but recently we're seeing a rise in the idea that agents and their unique preferences might just be important. So, when agents are unconstrained in power, they have these unique worldviews and they perceive threat in a unique way that would suggest that maybe some leaders are more sensitive to an ideological threat and other leaders are more sensitive to a material threat. And that is why, from 1914 to 1924, we see such a large inconsistency in Germany's foreign policy towards Soviet Russia. So how are we going to prove that agents matter? So I'm going to look at the case from 1914 to 1924, and extensively in the paper I'll go through all 10 years, but for you guys I'll just focus on the most interesting part. I begin in 1914 because 3 years before the rise of the Bolsheviks allows us to have a comparison period to see just what the ideological threat was in 1917 and how foreign policy shifted as soon as the Bolsheviks rose to power. I end in 1924 because Lenin's kind of excessive period of revolutionary exportation ends. He dies, but more importantly, German policy remains relatively consistent after that, and one leader kind of remains in power. Interestingly, though, we have this period from 1918 to 1922, and I've kind of delineated this along two important treaties. March 1918, we have the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and then 16th of April 1922, we'll get the Treaty of Rapallo. So what I'm going to do in this middle period is I'm going to show to you guys some of the most interesting contradictions of foreign policy. At the same time as cooperating with Soviet Russia, we also try to turn towards the West. And I'll show you how this is based on our agents in power. So just recall that we have first the rise of the Bolsheviks trying to spread revolution. Then we have a treaty that, maybe to be simplistic for a second here, starts us with a brief period of cooperation, but then because it's so annexationist on Germany's behalf, it leads to more animosity. So we start off with the ambassadors are expelled from either country. We're at the end of World War I. We're still facing the material threat from the Treaty of Versailles, and we have a weak, very domestically threatened government. Okay, let's look at the interesting actors. So first we have Hans von Siegt. This guy leads the German military. Here's an interesting quote that might explain to you where some of his preferences come from. Only in firm cooperation with a great Russia will Germany have the chance of regaining her position as a world power. Our policy would have had to be the same towards a Tsarist Russia. Now we have come to terms with Soviet Russia. So immediately we see Hans von Siegt is concerned with rebuilding Germany's capability to be a world power. This is a geopolitical interest. He wants to be able to materially challenge other states. We even see how he deprioritizes ideology because he would have the same policy equally towards a Tsarist Russia. So he doesn't care that the Bolsheviks are in power. It could be a monarchy. So, geopolitical motivations. And interestingly, in doing so, he will, even though he's staunchly conservative, will still pursue a secret military collaboration with Soviet Russia. He doesn't tell the domestic leaders that he's doing this, and this is where we'll see kind of our first big contradiction in policy. He has massive arguments with Ulrich von Brockdorff-Rantzau. He refused to work with the Soviet government under the assumption that it was possible that they could toss Germany to a French imperialistic capitalist power in order to prepare Germany's soil for world revolution. So here he's clearly concerned about an ideological threat. He understands that Russia wants to encourage revolution in Germany. However, he later concedes that the Soviet government could be won for a healthy cooperation with Germany. He is kind of our most complicated actor in this period because he, on the surface, appears to pursue geopolitical motivations, but he actually does so for a broader ideological aim. So, his motivations are predominantly ideological. He favors first negotiations with the West, and he says, okay, if negotiations with the West don't work, we'll tenuously start to cooperate with the Soviets. However, he did not approve of the secret military collaboration once he found out, initiated by our previous guy, because he thought that as soon as the West found out, this would sabotage Germany's opportunity to kind of have this rapprochement with the West. So he has a clear ideological motive, right? He's worried about world revolution. So he still favors cooperation, but he does that. This is not ignoring his ideological concerns. Instead, he's using Russia as a bargaining chip. He says, if I'm gonna threaten to the West that I'll get closer with the USSR and hope that in turn they get scared of that kind of world bloc power and instead get more concessions from the West. At the same time, he's kind of keeping his ideological enemy closer. He hopes that he can tell Russia, I'll only cooperate with you if you stop trying to antagonize Germany. So he kind of has an interesting two-pronged strategy here. Overall, though, he really prioritizes the domestic security, the domestic regime security in Germany, because he fears that as soon as he loses the West and the West's influence, everything will go to ruin and communism will survive. So lastly, we have Joseph Wirth. He initially pursues a policy of fulfillment. He says, I will pursue kind of this Treaty of Versailles. I will do my reparations payments. But then as soon as the West says, actually, we're not going to give you some Polish territory that you really wanted, he says, this policy of fulfillment has been shipwrecked. It's not going to work anymore. And instead, we're going to turn towards the Soviets. I place great value on immediate discussions regarding normal diplomatic relations with Soviets. So he has geopolitical motivations. As soon as he loses territory because of the West, he turns toward the Soviets, where he might get better deals. Initially with fulfillment, but then turning towards the Soviets. So what are the broader implications of this? Overall, we can see that focusing solely on geopolitical or ideological causes as a systemic theory grossly oversimplifies a very complex political process, and indeed, individuals matter when they're placed in positions with decision-making capacity. Their preferences should be considered. To connect this to our idea of peace, I would just maybe suggest that we consider practicing strategic empathy. This is the idea that in order to make peace, we need to understand the world from both our perspective and our rivals' perspective. What do they want? In order to do so, we can find the greatest compromise. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our presenters. We will have about 12 minutes to have a brief discussion, and I invite our presenters to come up to the table here. The way that we'll conduct this is that if you have a question you'd like to ask, just invite you to raise your hand. We'll bring you a microphone. We're just going to collect questions. So we're going to collect 4 or 5 questions and then give our panelists a few minutes to respond. So we'll just take as many as you have. And the floor is open to you. Okay, microphone's coming. Just tell us your name.
Hi, my name is Hazen Kim, and I'm in this class. Yeah. So I have questions for Rachel. Thank you for your presentation. As someone who have grown in Asian culture, it was really interesting to see how European politics and diplomacy works. I actually don't really know about the history, so I was Googling the relationship between Russia and Germany from the past to now, and I was curious what is current their diplomacy, relationship between Russia and Germany, especially after the Ukraine war.
This is a really good question.
Thank you. We're going to wait. Take notes. We're just going to collect questions. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Liza Nelch. I'm an American Studies major, and my question is also for Rachel. I was just wondering, if you thought that the best kind of way of approaching foreign policy would be between blending the two theories, or geopolitical versus ideological motivations, or if leaning on one or the other would be a better way of approaching international or foreign policy.
Thank you. In the back.
Hey, I'm Alex, studying psychology and Chinese. Questions for Libby. I'm really curious, from your read of the data, what you feel like could help the coalition sort of attract people from the fringes of AFD. What issues can they bargain on to start attracting people from the fringes back into the majority coalition.
Thank you. Are there other questions?
I'm Drake. I also have a question for Libby. In your presentation, you kind of underscored that this firewall is keeping the AFD from power, but it's not a permanent solution. And so kind of just hearkening to what Alex said, what path do you see forward to kind of solving this potential crisis?
Thank you. Okay, I have one for Brendan. I'm going to throw it out there. So when these NGOs that you study are effective, why are they effective? You highlighted a lot of challenges that they face and provided some potential strategies of networking. But what changes? Like, do you see evidence in the world that NGOs focusing on freedom of religion and belief actually change hearts and minds or policies or behavior? And if so, what do you trace those changes to? Are there any other questions before we let our panelists respond? Okay, Rachel, why don't we start with you? We're going to give each of you about 3 minutes, okay?
Okay, so I'll address the first question really fast, the current relationship kind of between Germany and what's Russia now. So Germany very much so is now kind of tied in with the West, especially with NATO and things like that. In the early stages of the Ukraine war.
Is your mic on?
I think it is.
Okay, just speak into it, maybe just local.
Okay. Okay. In the early stages of the war, for sure, all of kind of the West and Germany maybe followed the U.S.'s lead. So the U.S. And Europe were partnered with providing Ukraine aid. So Germany is definitely not pro-Russia in the war. Aid levels have certainly fluctuated and gone down, and especially as we see kind of shifting governance in Germany, that's going to change. But I would definitely, the relationship, the dynamic now is very different than it was in 1914. We're not kind of, like, we might be seeing ideological tensions, right? Like, Germany kind of legitimates power in the way that a democracy might, whereas Putin does in the way that an authoritarian country would. And so there's a clash there, but, you know, we also do still seek to prioritize our geopolitical interests and the security and kind of the balance of power. So I would still say that both are threats. I think, though, a lot of foreign policy emphasizes the geopolitical threat a little bit more. Okay, and then with regard, maybe, I'm not sure if you're attaching like normative implications, like is it maybe better morally to focus on material threats versus ideological threats, or which one is just more likely to lead to the security of state? Maybe I'll just both really fast. I think when we're talking about the security of the state, whichever threat is present is the one we should address, and so that's what a lot of these actors were trying to do, and they kind of saw, okay, well, this is what I think is the greatest threat, and so I'm gonna form foreign policy in that way. Obviously, if we're looking at things normatively, this is kind of why I brought up strategic empathy at the end. It's going to be best to understand what our rivals want. That's going to give us kind of the greatest ability to approach like a bargaining model in a successful way. So I would say it's not necessarily better morally to focus on one or the other as long as you're seeking for peace in the end. And in the same way, you can get security by looking at both.
Awesome. Okay, so to the two questions I received. First, how do we help the coalition attract people from the fringes? I think this is a super interesting question. I don't know if I really know the answers, but from what I can see, the CDU and the SPD are both moving towards the middle. So people who are more conservative are moving to the fringes. Well, conservative and liberal. They're moving towards either the left or the AFD. And so I think there isn't an easy solution, but making spaces where those people still have a voice that maybe isn't at the fringe. So I think the firewall is harmful in the sense that it is making a middle and an edge. And if that wasn't there in the same way, then the CDU and the SPD having their political platforms be where they were is a place where people could go to that. So like one of the quotes for somebody who voted for the AFD who moved from the CDU said, "The AFD is what the CDU used to be." So I don't quite know the answer, but I think that it comes in a lot of ways from people feeling like there isn't another party that has political power that represents their voice. And then in terms of the firewall not being a permanent solution, I agree that it's not a permanent solution. I think that it would be interesting to look, well, what I would like to do is look more at how the AFD does have coalitions with other political parties at the state level. I did notice trends to where voters in East Germany were less anti-immigrant. They had less extremist attitudes in a lot of ways. And I would be interested to see how much of that comes from feeling like they do have a voice in government by having a coalition and parties that they can cooperate with on a more issue basis. So, yeah, I'm not entirely sure, but I think that the firewall, by just saying we're not going to talk to people at all, even about specific issues, is pushing the AFD more to the extreme. And there could be places where there is common ground on specific issues that is not being discussed because it's taboo. So I think it will be interesting to see what happens, and I am looking forward to learning more about it and what we can learn from coalitions that do exist already in East Germany with the AFD.
Awesome. To answer your question, I think I'll give one example of a successful network and then one example of a successful issue. Successful networks, I think the UK, especially in the London interfaith community, has done an incredible job. For a while, London has been the world center, with New York as a close second for FORB advocacy, as well as Strasbourg, of course. But the EU does a great job. But they've been working for prisoners of conscience for quite a while and have had incredible success because organizations as far apart ideologically as like the ADF, for example, and the humanists, who are like on opposite sides politically, have come together to free prisoners of conscience across the world, including in Russia, in Turkey, and Kazakhstan, like all across the world, and Nigeria. And they do that by creating a few networks. There's the FORB NGO network, there's the FORB Business network, and then there's the APPG for freedom of religion or belief. And these all work together to pool funds and other resources like staff. The different small NGOs loan staff to these organizational superstructures that allow for real change to be made, including in policy. And one policy example, or actually two, in Myanmar, obviously the Rohingya genocide is horrific, but incredible progress has been made by religious NGOs specifically in protecting practice of minority religious groups in Myanmar through these networks. Another example is in Hong Kong, where there's been direct policy change for people like Jimmy Lai and other prisoners of conscience who are being really oppressed religiously by the Chinese government. And there's been direct policy change in the UK as it relates to trade policy and negotiations with China as a result.
Thank you. One more round of applause, please, for our participants. And I'm here to announce that you won the prize, leftovers. So make sure you take some kolaches for the road, and we really appreciate you being here, and we really appreciate your great presentation today. Thank you.